Ever, like, I don't know, stopped and thought about how we actually picture the world? Not just like what's on a map, but how we understand those places we live in, move through. It's like we take it for granted, but
It's a huge part of human experience,
yeah,
like our whole relationship to space. And turns out how we study that, well, that's evolved a lot.
exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. We're looking at excerpts from Kevin R. Cox's book, Making Human Geography.
Oh, fantastic choice. He really lays out how this field went from like basic map reading to this incredibly rich way of thinking about places.
Totally. So Cox takes us back to the late 19th century, when human geography was just becoming a thing in universities.
Yeah, those early days were interesting, to say the least. That's when this idea of environmental determinism was king.
Oh, right. Like your environment totally dictated how well your society would turn out.
Exactly. It's almost hard to believe now, but people genuinely thought climate, landscape, those things determined everything. Even like how advanced a culture could become.
Wild, right? I mean, talk about a deterministic view.
Totally. And you had figures like Ellsworth Huntington, who was convinced that climate directly affected civilization.
Didn't he even say something about certain groups of people?
Oh, yeah, he did. He categorized people into what he called low races and high races and thought that the, quote, low races could actually improve if they just moved to a more, quote, stimulating climate. Looking back, it really shows the biases and assumptions that were baked into these early theories.
Yeah, definitely makes you cringe a little. Thank goodness we've, moved past that kind of thinking. But important to see where those ideas came from, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It helps us understand how the field is developed and how we can avoid repeating those mistakes. And to be fair to those early geographers, even back then, not everyone was buying into this whole environmental determinism thing.
True, true. Like, Cox talks about Halford Mackinder, who is already challenging this idea that we're just puppets of our environment.
Totally. Mackinder was arguing that, hello, social relations, economic systems, all that human stuff plays a huge role too. Like, we're not just passively responding to the environment, we're actively shaping it.
Right. He was really emphasizing human agency.
He was. One of his most famous quotes is, "Human riches and comparative security are based today on the division and coordination of labor."
There you go. It's not just about the land itself, it's how we interact with it, organize ourselves on it. And that leads to this really interesting shift in human geography, moving away from environmental determinism and towards what Cox calls area studies.
Right, and this is where figures like Carl Sauer come in, with his focus on cultural landscapes.
Ah, so instead of just how the environment shapes us, it's about how we leave our mark on the environment.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Sauer argued that each culture kind of imprints itself on the landscape through its activities and creates this unique cultural landscape.
Like it's not just nature out there, it's nature interacting with human culture over time.
Totally. Sauer has this great quote, "The cultural landscape is fashioned out of a natural landscape by a culture group." It makes you look around and wonder, like, what were the influences that shaped this place?
Right. What are all the layers of history etched into this landscape? It's a much more dynamic way of thinking about our relationship with the world.
Definitely. And that leads us to another important development, the rise of what Cox calls the spatial tradition.
Ah, yes, the location era.
Hmm.
It's all about understanding how spatial relationships, like where things are in relation to each other, influence economic and social patterns. And we see people like J. Russell Smith coming onto the scene. His work on world economic geography was pretty influential.
Oh, absolutely. And he wasn't just describing patterns. He was trying to understand the why behind them. Like those control and production regions he talked about really got people thinking about economic relationships across space.
Totally. And then there's, oh, who was it? Mackinder, again, this time with his work on nodality, emphasizing transportation hubs, industrial centers, those points where everything connects.
Yes, and he even came up with the term artificial nodality, which is fascinating. Recognizing that human actions can actually create these new, important centers, not just natural features. Think about how cities popped up along newly built railroads, for example.
It's like we're shaping our own geography.
So cool.
What's interesting is that Cox points out how back then there wasn't this rigid academic specialization we have today. Like you'd have geographers contributing to both human and physical geography.
Totally. Someone like Dudley Stamp was doing work on land utilization, which could easily fall under either umbrella. It speaks to a more, I don't know, holistic view of geography back then. Like, they weren't just focused on one tiny piece of the puzzle. They were trying to see the whole picture. Yeah,
Definitely. It was about those connections, the interplay between humans and the environment. But even with all these advances, they were still limited in a lot of ways. Like, they relied heavily on comparing maps, which can only get you so far when you're trying to understand complex social and environmental systems.
for sure. It's like they needed more nuanced tools, more sophisticated theories to really dig into these big questions.
And those needs set the stage for a pretty dramatic shift in the field. But we're going to have to save that story for after the break.
So it's like human geography needed, I don't know, a bit of an upgrade. Like they had all these cool ideas about space and people, but needed new ways to really dig into it.
It's true. They were working with like limited tools, and then boom, the quantitative revolution hits in the mid 20th century. Talk about a game changer.
Right. Suddenly it's all about numbers, data, statistics. What drove that shift, do you think?
Well, the world was changing fast after World War II. You had this rise in like regional planning, economic development projects, trying to get a handle on urban sprawl.
Makes sense. Practical problems needing, well, practical solutions, I guess. Exactly. Policymakers needed hard data, not just theories. And human geography stepped up to provide those tools. It's like suddenly geographers could say, hey, we can measure this stuff, analyze it, maybe even predict what's coming next.
So it's not just describing patterns on a map anymore. It's about understanding those patterns in a much deeper way, right?
Absolutely. And it led to some really important work. But like any big shift, it wasn't all smooth sailing, you know?
Mm.
Cox talks about how at first things weren't always so quantitative, like they were still figuring out how to use these new tools.
Right. It's like having all the ingredients, but not quite sure how to bake the cake yet.
Exactly. You see this with someone like Peter Haggett, who is doing amazing work with spatial systems. But the quantitative methods back then, they were still catching up to his vision.
And then you have figures like Chisholm, Hall. They were bringing the spatial lens to real-world issues like, where people live in rural areas, how to plan growing cities.
Absolutely. They were showing how powerful these ideas could be.
Yeah.
And that's when we start seeing this distinction emerge between what Cox calls theoretical and empirical models.
Ooh, okay. Break that down for me. What's the difference?
So a theoretical model is like Kristall's central place theory. You heard of that one?
It rings a bell, but remind me.
Right. So imagine you're designing a city from scratch. You want to make sure people have access to all the things they need, groceries, schools, you name it.
Makes sense.
So Kristaller, he comes up with this model, right? It says that different sizes of towns will naturally space themselves out based on what they offer. Big cities will have specialized stuff that people travel for, while smaller towns serve more local needs.
Oh, right. And the bigger the city, the farther people will come to get that special thing they need, like a concert or something.
Exactly. That's central place theory in a nutshell. And it's purely theoretical based on logic and assumptions.
So then what's an empirical model? Is that like going out and seeing if those theories actually hold up in real life?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You take those models and test them against real-world data. And sometimes they match up beautifully. Other times, not so much.
Which makes sense, right? The world is messy. You can't always predict human behavior with 100% certainty.
Totally. And that realization led to some pretty important critiques of the quantitative revolution.
Oh, like what?
Well, critics were saying, hold on, all these numbers and models, they don't capture the full picture, do they? Like, human behavior isn't always rational. We don't always make decisions based on, like, the shortest distance or the lowest cost. There's more to it than that.
It's like my mental map of my city is probably totally different from someone else's. We might live in the same place, but our experiences, our memories, they shape how we move through the world, right?
Exactly. And that's a huge part of what behavioral geography is all about. Reginald Gollidge, for example, with his concept of mental maps, he really pushed geographers to consider those individual perceptions.
Right. Like, it's one thing to map out a city's layout, but it's another thing entirely to understand how people actually use that space. The shortcuts they take, the places they avoid.
And all the reasons behind those choices. That's what makes it so fascinating. So you've got this push for more rigorous science, but also this recognition that human experience, that subjective side of things, matters too. It's a balancing act for sure.
So we've gone from like just looking at maps to thinking about mental maps, from this idea that the environment controls us to trying to measure everything about space.
It's a wild ride through the history of ideas, isn't it?
Yeah.
But you hit on something important there. By the time human geography gets to the 1970s, things start to shift again.
Yeah, it's like they took a step back and said, okay, are we missing something here?
Yeah.
The world was changing fast, right? All these social movements popping up, questioning the status quo.
Exactly. And human geographers, they weren't immune to that. They started to realize, hey, we can't just ignore all these social and political forces shaping the world, especially when they're at the root of so much inequality.
Like, geography isn't just about where things are, but who has the power to decide where they are, who benefits, who gets left out.
Exactly. And it's no surprise that someone like Karl Marx, with his ideas about power, class, inequality, starts to have a huge influence on the field during this time.
Makes sense, right? You can't talk about how space is organized without talking about who's doing the organizing, who profits from it, you know?
Totally. It's not just abstract theories anymore. It's about real-world impacts. Who has access to resources, who gets pushed to the margins, all of that.
And this is where David Harvey's work becomes so important, right? He really brought those questions about power, class relations, to the forefront of human geography.
Oh, absolutely. His concept of the spatial fix, for example, was groundbreaking. Basically, he's saying that capitalism, as it grows, it creates its own problems, like overaccumulation, right? So what does it do? It tries to fix those problems by expanding into new spaces, looking for new markets, new resources to exploit.
It's like it's always searching for that next place to extract profit from.
Exactly. And you see this all the time, right? Companies moving operations overseas for cheaper labor, governments investing in huge infrastructure projects, all trying to keep the wheels of capitalism turning.
And that's not to say that all development is bad, obviously, but it's crucial to be aware of those power dynamics at play, right? How these spatial decisions can have really different impacts on different groups of people.
For sure. But it wasn't just about bringing in Marxist theory. Humanistic geography also emerged during this time, kind of as a counterpoint to what some saw as the, I don't know, the coldness of all those numbers and models.
Yeah, like we're not just data points on a map, right?
Exactly. We have feelings, we have memories, we form attachments to places. Think about Yi-Fu Tuan and his work on the experience of place. He argued that how we feel about a place, the meanings we attach to it, that's just as important as its physical characteristics.
Like that feeling you get when you think about your childhood home or that special vacation spot. It's deeply personal.
Totally. And then you've got someone like Donald Meinig who took it a step further. He was like, let's not just analyze meaning, let's express it. He wanted geographers to engage with creativity, to use art, literature, to capture those rich, complex experiences of place.
It's almost like human geography was realizing it needed more tools in its toolkit, right? Not just maps and numbers, but stories, poems, paintings.
Absolutely. But just when you thought it couldn't get any more complex, along come postmodernism and post-structuralism to really shake things up.
Oh yeah, those two. Always a recipe for some serious head scratching, but in a good way, hopefully.
Right. What's interesting is that they challenge the very idea of objective truth. They're like, hold on, there's no single story that explains everything. Knowledge is always partial, situated, influenced by power.
It's like we were talking about earlier with mental maps, right? We all see the world through our own unique lens.
Exactly. And this is where someone like Edward Said comes in, with his concept of Orientalism. He argued that even the way we study the world, the way we produce knowledge about other cultures, is influenced by power relations, often in ways that reinforce existing hierarchies.
So it's not just about what we know about a place, but how we came to know it, whose voices are being heard, who's being silenced.
Exactly. And we can't forget the crucial contributions of feminist geography during this time.
Right. Bringing gender into the mix, showing how space is experienced differently by men and women.
For sure. Feminist geographers were like, hold on, why are we still designing cities as if everyone experiences them the same way? They brought attention to issues like safety, access to childcare, how women often have very different needs and priorities when it comes to public spaces.
And that's huge, right? Because it's not just about making spaces more inclusive for women. It's about recognizing that when you design for the margins, for those who've been traditionally excluded, you often end up with a better solution for everyone.
Totally. So yeah, it's been quite a journey. We've gone from those early environmental determinists to these incredibly rich and nuanced understandings of how space and power intersect.
And what's so cool is that all these different ideas, all these different approaches, they're still influencing how we think about the world today. It's a reminder that knowledge is always evolving. It's not about finding the one right answer, but about asking better questions, being open to new perspectives, and understanding that our relationship with space is constantly being shaped and reshaped by, well, us.